And now I invite you to join me in welcoming him to the Carnegie Council. Thank you very much.
There are two books out at the moment, as you know, probably, with about the financial crisis, with Fail in the title. My book, How Markets Fail, and Andrew Ross Sorkin's book, Too Big to Fail. I look on these two books as complementary in many ways. If you're looking for a book about, Hank Paulson retching and the Treasury Secretary. Anybody going to help me out? Tim Geithner, who I interview frequently, so sorry, Tim. Running around Wall Street at 6 a.m. worrying about what he's going to have for breakfast, then you should read Andrew's book, which is a very good narrative. When people ask me what's the difference between the two books, I say Andrew's is the fly-on-the-wall account. Mine is the view from the orbiting satellite. What I'm trying to do in this book is explain how the various elements of the crisis fit together. Seems to me there have been 3, possibly 4 theories of what happened put forward so far. First one, which probably the man on the street subscribes to, is it was all a matter of greed. It was basically Bernie Madoffism writ large. The second theory, I think, which is quite a few behavioral economists such as Bob Schiller and George Akerlof have put forward, is that this was basically an instant of the madness of crowds, that we had sort of collective irrationality, disaster myopia. People thought the housing market was going to go up forever. They sort of lost their minds, and the traders lost their minds temporarily. I saw Bob Schiller giving a speech a couple of weeks ago, and he said it's all about the stories people were telling each other. That's the second theory. Third theory, which is very common on the right, is that this was a government failure. That ultimately, it comes in various guises, mostly to do with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Community Reinvestment Act. Basically, the government caused the problem by encouraging people to invest in subprime securities, banks to lend to people who otherwise wouldn't have got loans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac propping up the subprime market, etc. And as I say, quite a few people take it all the way back to the Community Reinvestment Act of '79. I don't believe in any of those theories. I think there's an element of an element of truth in each of them, but I really see this as an example of market failure writ large. What does market failure mean? It means that markets fail to act in the way they're supposed to, according to the free market theories going all the way back to Adam Smith. The basic theory of the free market is that if you add individual rationality to competition, you get a good outcome. The market aggregates people's actions and produces an overall socially beneficial outcome. That's the theory of the invisible hand. And of course it was applied to financial markets in this case. My argument is that ultimately this is not a failure of the government, although the government, as I'll speak about a bit later, did make some mistakes. Not just greed. Greed is a perennial on Wall Street. I mean, probably a lot of people in the audience work on Wall Street, so I don't want to be too insulting, but there is an element of self-selection. If you want to make a lot of money, you go to Wall Street. So not surprising we find some greed there. And the third one, mass stupidity, again, I think there was some stupidity, but my argument, which I'll lay out a bit more length in a while, is that this was more to do with rational self-interest rather than irrational self-interest. So the way I structured the book, that's a sort of overview. The way I've structured the book is in 3 parts. As I say, I ultimately see this crisis as a crisis of ideas and misapplied ideas. So the first third of the book, I try and explain where this idea of the free market as a self-regulating device comes from. And I go all the way back to Adam Smith. And I probably am the only person in the room who has actually read The Wealth of Nations. I'd never read it, even though I've been writing about economics for 20 years, I can honestly say I'd never read it front to back before then, although I'd recently referred to it. But it's a very long book. In this case, I did actually go back and read it all. So I take it back to Smith, and I'm not making a wholesale critique of the free market. This book is not meant, as I say in the introduction, I'm not saying we should resurrect Gosplan or switch to some other system completely. My argument is free markets are all good in their own place. And as I say, I try to point out in the first third of the book what the strength of the free markets is. And I think it's been elucidated in all sorts of ways since Smith, but I think the basics are there in Smith. One is the division of labour. People specialise in what they do best, going back to Adam Smith's famous pin factory, where if you have one guy trying to make pins by himself, he may make 1 or 2 in a week. If you put 10 each doing specialized tasks, one cutting the metal, one sharpening, one attaching the heads, suddenly they can churn out thousands in a week. Free markets encourage specialization. That leads to big productivity growth. The second and very desirable aspect of free markets is they encourage innovation. If you innovate and produce something which people want to buy, you generally make a profit, at least for a while. If you produce shoddy products or bad products people don't want to buy, you go out of business. So there's a feedback mechanism. If you do well, you're rewarded. If you do badly, you're punished. Most other economic systems, like feudalism and communism, lacked that basic feedback mechanism. So if you add those two things together, the division of labor and this feedback mechanism, you've basically got a machine for productivity growth. And that's incredibly important. If you go back, the other person I went back and read was Malthus. You go back to when Smith was writing, and just after that, people really thought, Malthus wasn't an outlier. A lot of people thought like him that there was going to be mass starvation with mass population growth. Why didn't it happen? Because productivity grew faster than the labor force. And it's based in, as I think the specialization and innovation in the free market. The third very desirable aspect of free markets is you don't need a central planner. The market is effectively, the market is a coordination mechanism. When you think about that, we take it for granted, but if you think about the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people just in the US, billions of people around the world, each going out to work every day, produce goods and services, who tells them what to make? Who tells them how much to make? It's the market that tells them. There's a price system. They react to the price system. Attempts have been made to supplant that with a sort of indicative planning in Europe, with straightforward planning in the Eastern Bloc. None of them worked for very long. They can work in the early stages of industrialization. You get sort of Stalin's 5-year plans. They can ramp up steel production or grain production, but it's not a very effective mechanism for advanced economies. It can't produce the product differentiation, all the different goods and services we want to buy. So that's, as I say, this book is the Economist actually said this book provides a strong argument for free markets, and I think it's true for the first third of the book, in which I take Smith. I then go through various more advanced derivations of it, bringing you up through the Chicago School and general equilibrium theory and lots of other sort of sub-disciplines which will probably only of interest to economists. But the basic ideas were all there in Smith. And most of the stuff since then. Actually, Milton Friedman, to give him his due, was very explicit about this. If you go back and read Capitalism and Freedom or Free to Choose, he says as much as that most of this is in Smith. I'm just sort of updating it and producing some new examples. So that's the first third of the book. And I call that utopian economics because I think the basic good ideas have been misapplied. And I'll explain why in a minute. I think the Chicago School in particular, when they sort of applied these to financial markets through the rational expectations hypothesis associated with Bob Lucas and the efficient markets hypothesis associated with Gene Famer and others, they took these ideas about free markets, applied them to financial markets. And they, in my opinion, because of the speculative aspect of financial markets, you can't apply these theories. When you do, you get into big trouble, as I'll explain in a couple of minutes. So that's the first third of the book. Second third of the book, I try and explain something called reality-based economics, which is just a sort of fancy phrase for not even really heterodox economics, what I would call mainstream Keynesian economics, as I was taught it 20 years ago, 25 years ago in Oxford and at Harvard. There's various I start off with Keynes himself. Again, I was going to say he's unfashionable. He's actually becoming very fashionable. Even some of the Chicago School, including Judge Posner, have come out as Keynesians recently. So until recently, unfashionable Keynes. And I think Keynes' great contribution was this idea that a financially driven economy is different to just a sort of agrarian economy. There's something about the financial system which adds a level of complexity and potential instability to the economy. I spent a lot of time on the so-called beauty contest analogy, which I think is very instructive. And that's the idea that investors, instead of investing on ultimate value, basically try and outguess each other. In 1930s in England, there were beauty contests in use. It was a bit sexist, this story, but I'm afraid that's how it was in the 30s. They'd have a page given over to pretty girls, and the readers had to write in, and you won a prize if you picked the prettiest. Except it's not quite that simple, because you win a prize if you pick the prettiest girl that everybody, one who comes top of the opinion poll. So what are you trying to do when you try to win a contest like that? You're not trying to say who the prettiest is. You're trying to figure out who the girl who the average opinion will think the prettiest. Keynes figured that out, and then he said, well, actually, if you get clever, then there's a second degree. You don't think about the average opinion, what the average opinion thinks the prettiest girl will be. You've got to think about what the average opinion thinks the average opinion thinks the prettiest girl is going to be. And there are third, fourth, and fifth derivations, as he said. And actually, a lot of what happens in financial markets is this sort of approach. If you work on a hedge fund, most of the hedge funds, they've got momentum funds, they've got value funds, but even the value funds tend to be driven by how they think the analysts are going to react to various statistics. It's very much trying to outguess everybody else. So I take you back to Keynes, and then it's not just about financial markets. I mean, the idea of market failure is much broader than just finance. I've got a chapter about spillovers, externalities, global warming, taking you back to Pigou, the other famous British economist, not as famous as he should be, of the early 20th century, which I actually wrote up in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago. And Pigou's idea, which again is now a mainstream idea, there's a Pigou Club for Republicans, which Greg Mankiw at Harvard set up. His great contribution was this idea of spillovers or externalities, that the market is very good at measuring private benefits and private costs, but very poor at measuring social costs and social benefits. For example, the classic example, well, I'll give you Pigou's example, is a train, a new rail service, which sets up, say, between New York and Boston. That clearly provides a lot of value for the customers. They can go faster, that's all good. The prices reflect what people are willing to pay. But what about if he was riding in the steam age? There were lots of sparks emitted from these engines and just pieces of fire coming out of the engine. What about if it sets the surrounding woods ablaze? Who pays for that? Well, it's the owner of the field. The market mechanism doesn't give the railway company any incentive to pay that. Now, if you think about global warming for a second, it's exactly analogous. The people who produce the greenhouse gases, the power stations or the SUV drivers or anybody else who burns a lot of carbon fuel, they don't take into account the costs they're creating for, in this case, future generations, usually, or maybe some people who are young, maybe global warming will be so serious by 2050. But whatever, they don't take into account the ultimate social consequences of their actions. And what Pigou said is, to make them take account of it, we need a tax system, what he called extraordinary restraints. So that's the sort of underlying basis of the argument for carbon taxes, which is not a controversial idea in economics anymore. As I say, even Republican economists agree with that, or quite a few of them do. It's just incredibly politically unpopular, so nobody wants to put it forward. So that's another example of market failure. Then I better speed up a bit, because I promised not to speak for more than half an hour. The other examples which I run through are sort of informational problems. If you think about the healthcare, for example, another very topical aspect, the problem with the healthcare system is another form of market failure. The private insurers, there's a big informational problem there. If you try to buy private insurance, the private healthcare insurers don't know your medical history, obviously. So they tend to assume if you're out on the open market looking for insurance, you've probably been bumped by somebody else who may be chronically ill. So they're very reluctant to offer individual coverage at reasonable rates. They'll offer you a very extortionate rate, but that's why, unless you've got employer-covered coverage, it's just very expensive. That's an informational asymmetry, as the economists would call it in the jargon, and it's very difficult to deal with. There's another form of market failure called moral hazard, which is if you're